The room fell silent, not because Ethan Cole had said something remarkable, but because he hadn't said enough to stop them from laughing. Standing alone at the far end of a sleek glass boardroom, under cold white lights that reflected off polished marble and billion-dollar decisions, Ethan looked painfully out of place. His worn jacket, his calloused hands, the small metal engine sitting on the table in front of him. It all felt like a mistake the moment Victoria Hale leaned back in her chair and smiled. Not a warm smile, a measured surgical one. "This is what you brought us?" she asked, her voice calm but cutting through the room like a blade. A few executives exchanged glances before one of them let out a quiet chuckle, and then another followed, until the sound spread low, controlled but unmistakably mocking. Ethan didn't flinch. He just looked at the engine, then back at her. "It's not what it looks like," he said quietly. That only made it worse. Victoria leaned forward now, fingers interlocked, eyes scanning the crude welds, the mismatched parts, the uneven casing that looked more scrapyard than breakthrough. "Mr. Cole," she continued, her tone turning almost sympathetic, "we invest in the future, not in experiments that belong in a garage." A few louder laughs this time. Someone whispered, "Did he build that with spare lawnmower parts?" Another voice added, "I've seen better in a high school lab." Ethan swallowed, but his voice didn't shake. "Run it," he said. The room paused, not out of respect, but curiosity. Victoria raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me." "Just run it." Ethan repeated, firmer now. For a brief second, something flickered in her expression, annoyance, maybe even intrigue, but it vanished just as quickly. She stood up, smoothing her blazer. "We're done here." The decision landed like a gavel. Security was already stepping forward. The meeting moved on without him. Chairs turned. Screens lit up again. Ethan's engine, his years of work, was left sitting there, ignored, dismissed, reduced to a punchline. But as he reached the door, one thing didn't follow the script. In the far corner of the room where the laughter hadn't quite reached, a man hadn't looked away. Daniel Reeves, silent, observant. Worth more than everyone else in that room combined, was still staring at the engine. Not with amusement, not with doubt, but with a kind of focus that made everything else feel suddenly irrelevant. And just before the door closed behind Ethan, Daniel spoke for the first time, his voice low but impossible to ignore. "Wait," he said. Ethan Cole didn't turn around immediately when he heard the word wait. Not because he hadn't heard it, but because years of being overlooked had trained him to expect that even interruptions rarely changed outcomes, especially in rooms like this, where power didn't just speak. It decided, and yet something in the tone steady, unhurried. Uninterested in approval made him pause with his hand still on the glass door as the faint hum of the boardroom quieted again. Not out of respect this time, but confusion as Daniel Reeves rose slowly from his seat in the far corner, adjusting his cuff as if the moment were routine, not disruptive, while Victoria Hale turned, her expression tightening just enough to reveal that this wasn't part of her script. "Daniel," she said, controlled but firm. "We've already concluded this presentation," but Daniel didn't look at her. Not yet. His eyes fixed instead on the small engine sitting abandoned on the table. "You concluded it?" he replied calmly, stepping forward. "I haven't." And just like that, the room shifted again, subtle but undeniable, because when someone like Daniel Reeves, whose investments had built empires and dismantled others overnight, decided something wasn't over, it wasn't over. And Ethan, still standing by the door, slowly let his hand fall as he turned back. Not with hope exactly, but with something quieter, something more dangerous. The possibility that he might be seen, even if only for a moment. And Daniel reached the table, studying the engine without touching it. His silence stretching long enough to make the executives uneasy. The earlier laughter now hanging awkwardly in the air like a mistake no one wanted to acknowledge. "You built this yourself?" Daniel finally asked, not looking up, and Ethan nodded once. "Every part." He said, his voice steady despite the weight of the room pressing down on him. With what resources? Daniel continued now, glancing at him briefly, and Ethan gave a small, almost tired smile. Whatever I could afford, he answered, which drew a faint scoff from someone near the back, but Daniel ignored it. His attention already returning to the engine as if the rest of the room had ceased to exist. "Does it run?" he asked, and before Ethan could answer, Victoria stepped in, her patience, thinning Daniel with all due respect. "We don't have time to entertain. Does it run?" Daniel repeated this time louder, and the room fell completely silent. The authority in his voice not aggressive but absolute, leaving no space for interruption, and Ethan took a step forward, his heart pounding now. "Yes," he said simply. "It runs." Daniel nodded once, then turned to Victoria. "Then we should see it," and for a moment, just a moment, the power in the room tilted not enough to overturn it, but enough to crack the certainty that had dismissed Ethan minutes earlier, and Victoria held his gaze, calculating, weighing whether pushing back was worth the cost, and after a brief pause that felt longer than it was, she exhaled sharply. "Fine," she said. Her tone clipped. 5 minutes. But Ethan shook his head slightly. "Not here," he said. And a ripple of irritation moved through the room again. "Of course not," Victoria muttered, already turning away, because why would anything about this be convenient? But Daniel only smiled faintly. "Then we go where it does," he said, and before anyone could object further, he was already moving toward the door, forcing the rest of them to decide whether to follow or be left out. And reluctantly, one by one, they did. Though the shift from a pristine corporate tower to the narrow streets leading to Ethan's garage felt almost surreal, like stepping into a different world entirely. And when they finally arrived, the contrast was impossible to ignore: the peeling paint, the flickering overhead light, the smell of oil and metal that clung to the air and in the corner. A small workbench cluttered with tools that looked older than some of the executives standing there. Clearly uncomfortable, clearly out of place. And yet, this was where Ethan came alive. His movements more confident now, as he approached the full-sized version of the engine, carefully assembled each piece, bearing the marks of trial and error of nights without sleep. Of persistence that had no audience. "It doesn't look like much," one engineer whispered under his breath, unable to stop himself. And Ethan didn't argue, didn't defend. He just reached for the ignition, pausing for a second as if acknowledging something unseen. And that was when a small voice broke through the tension, "Dad." And every head turned as a little girl stepped into the garage doorway, her backpack slipping off one shoulder, her eyes wide at the sight of strangers in suits filling their space. "Lily," Ethan said softly, his expression changing instantly, the tension easing just enough to reveal something deeper, something warmer. "What are you doing home already?" he asked. Kneeling slightly to meet her at eye level. "School ended early," she replied, glancing curiously at the group. "Who are they?" And Ethan hesitated, then smiled faintly. "People who might finally listen," he said, and Lily looked at the engine, then back at him. "Did they like it?" she asked, the innocence in her voice cutting sharper than any mockery had earlier, and for a moment Ethan couldn't answer, the truth sitting heavy on his tongue. But then he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "They're about to see it," he said instead. And something in that moment, something unguarded, something real, shifted the room in a way no presentation ever could, because this wasn't just an invention anymore. It wasn't a pitch or a prototype. It was a promise, a lifeline. A father's refusal to give up on something that mattered not just to him, but to the small person standing beside him. And Daniel watched this exchange closely, his earlier curiosity deepening into something more certain, while Victoria stood near the back, arms crossed, her expression unreadable, but no longer dismissive, because even she could feel it now, that quiet, persistent weight of something that didn't fit into her earlier judgment. And Ethan stood turning back to the engine, his hand hovering over the ignition once more. "It's not perfect," he said almost to himself. "But it works. And with that, he started it, and the sound that followed wasn't loud or dramatic. Not at first, but it was different, smoother, cleaner. A hum that seemed almost too efficient, too controlled. And the engineers leaned in despite themselves, their skepticism battling with the evidence unfolding in front of them. While Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, not in doubt, but in recognition, as if he were seeing pieces of a puzzle fall into place, and Ethan adjusted a dial, the engine responding instantly. Its output stabilizing in a way that defied expectation, and suddenly the room, the garage, the people, the tension felt smaller compared to what was happening on that table. Because this wasn't scrap. It wasn't a hobby. It was something else entirely. Something that didn't need validation to exist, only someone willing to see it. And for the first time since he had walked into that boardroom and been laughed out of it, Ethan wasn't invisible anymore. The moment the engine stabilized into that impossibly smooth, controlled hum, something in the air shifted so quietly that no one could pinpoint exactly when doubt began to unravel into attention. But they all felt it. Especially the engineers who had dismissed it minutes earlier, because now they were leaning in, not out of politeness, but because what they were seeing did not match anything they had ever worked with. And Ethan didn't speak at first. He simply adjusted a series of small, almost crude-looking dials. Each movement precise, practiced, and strangely elegant, despite the rough construction surrounding it, and the numbers on the handheld diagnostic device Daniel had pulled from his pocket began to climb stabilize. And then, most unsettling of all, hold steady at a level that made no sense for something built in a garage with limited resources. "That's not calibrated," one engineer finally said, his voice tight, almost defensive, as if the only way to protect his understanding of the world was to question the measurement itself. But Daniel didn't respond. His eyes locked on the readout as he slowly stepped closer, crouching beside the engine, studying the airflow channels. The unconventional arrangement of components that should have created inefficiencies, but somehow didn't. And Ethan watched him carefully, not with pride, not yet, but with a quiet readiness, like a man who had spent years waiting for this exact moment and wasn't about to rush it. "Explain it," Daniel said, without looking up, and Ethan hesitated just long enough to choose his words. "It reduces energy loss by redirecting thermal waste back into the cycle," he said, his voice steady. "Most systems let that dissipate," and one of the engineers scoffed again, but weaker this time. "That's been attempted before," he muttered. "It destabilizes under load." Ethan nodded once, as if he had expected that. "It does," he said. "If you follow the standard configuration," and then he pointed to a section of the engine that looked almost improvised, a set of angled conduits welded in a way that no textbook would recommend. So I didn't, and the silence that followed was heavier now, not dismissive but uncomfortable. Because what he was implying wasn't just innovation, it was deviation from accepted limitations, and that was harder to accept than failure. Daniel stood slowly, his expression unreadable but focused. "Run a stress test," he said. And Ethan glanced at Lily for a brief second, as if grounding himself before turning back and increasing the output, the engine responding instantly. The hum deepening but never losing its smoothness, never faltering, and the numbers climbed again higher this time, pushing past thresholds that should have triggered instability alarms. Something but nothing happened except consistency. And one by one, the engineers fell silent, their skepticism dissolving into something closer to unease, because if this worked, if this held, then everything they knew about efficiency ceilings, about cost to performance ratios, about the limits of current systems, it all had to be reconsidered. And Daniel exhaled slowly, not in surprise but in confirmation, as if something he had suspected was now undeniable. "How long have you been working on this?" he asked, finally, looking at Ethan directly, and Ethan shrugged slightly. "Years," he said. "Between jobs." And that answer landed differently now because it reframed everything, not as a hobby, not as a desperate gamble, but as sustained, disciplined effort carried out in obscurity. And Victoria, who had remained near the back of the garage, arms still crossed but no longer rigid, stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the concrete floor. "What's the scalability?" she asked. Her tone controlled but sharper than before, because now she wasn't dismissing him. She was testing him. And Ethan met her gaze without hesitation. "Modular," he replied. "It can be adapted across different systems, with minimal redesign," and she nodded once, absorbing that, already calculating implications, costs, timelines, market disruption. And for the first time since this had begun, there was no trace of mockery in her expression, only focus. But Daniel spoke again before she could take control of the conversation. "You didn't patent this," he said, not as a question, and Ethan shook his head. "Couldn't afford to," he admitted, and a flicker of something crossed Daniel's face. Interest, certainly, but also urgency. Because now the stakes had shifted. This wasn't just about potential anymore. It was about vulnerability, about the possibility that something this valuable could be taken, replicated, buried. And Victoria seemed to reach the same conclusion at the same time, because she stepped closer now, her earlier distance gone. "We can help with that," she said, her voice smoother, more measured. "Our legal team can secure." "At what cost?" Ethan interrupted, not aggressively, but firmly enough to halt her, and the room stilled again, because this was no longer a man asking for approval. This was someone negotiating from a position that hadn't existed an hour ago. And Victoria paused just long enough to reassess before offering a practiced smile. "That depends on the partnership structure," she said. But Daniel shook his head slightly, almost amused. "No," he said quietly, and both of them turned to him. "It depends on what it's worth," he continued. And that sentence hung in the air like a spark near dry fuel, because everyone in that garage understood what it implied, not just interest, but competition, and the shift was immediate. Subtle, but undeniable, as the other investors who had followed initially out of curiosity now began to exchange glances, their earlier detachment replaced by calculation, and one of them, a woman in a navy suit who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. "Mr. Cole," she said, her tone professional but intent, "have you considered outside funding?" And Ethan looked at her. Then at Daniel, then briefly at Victoria, the weight of their attention settling on him in a way that felt almost unreal, and for a second the garage, the engine, the years of quiet work, they all seemed to converge into this single moment where everything could change, but also everything could be lost if he chose wrong. "I've considered being heard," he said finally, and the simplicity of that answer cut through the tension more effectively than any technical explanation could have, because it reminded them all of where this had started. Not in a lab, not in a boardroom, but here in a space that had no business producing something like this. And Daniel smiled faintly, the first genuine expression he had shown. "Then you are," he said, and as if that were a signal, the room shifted again. This time, not just in perception, but in momentum, because phones were being pulled out, quiet messages sent, names mentioned in low voices, and Victoria, recognizing the change, stepped forward again, her composure intact, but her urgency now visible beneath it. "Ethan," she said, using his first name for the first time, "we should move this discussion somewhere more appropriate." But Ethan glanced around his garage at the tools, the worn surfaces, the place where all of this had been built, and shook his head slightly. "This is where it works," he said, and there was no defiance in it, just truth, and for a moment no one argued, because they all understood now that what made this engine valuable wasn't just its output. It was the fact that it existed here at all. And that meant something none of them had accounted for, something harder to measure, harder to control. And as the engine continued to run steady, unshaken, the pressure in the room began to build. Not from doubt, but from realization. Because this wasn't just a discovery anymore, it was an opportunity. And opportunities like this didn't stay neutral for long. They attracted attention, competition, and eventually conflict. And as Daniel stepped back, giving the space just enough room to breathe, he spoke again, quieter this time, but with a weight that carried further than anything said before. "You might want to decide quickly," he said, looking at Ethan, "because now that they see it, They won't unsee it. And that was when Ethan understood that the real challenge wasn't building the engine, it was what came next. By the time Ethan Cole stepped into the glass-domed hall of the Global Mobility Summit 2 nights later, the world had already begun to tilt in a way he could feel, but not yet fully understand, because the same people who would have ignored his name a week ago were now whispering it behind tailored sleeves and glowing screens, and the invitation that had arrived that morning last minute. Unplanned, impossible to refuse, had placed him at the center of a stage designed for billion-dollar announcements, not garage-built revolutions. And yet here he was, walking past towering LED displays, past polished prototypes from companies that had spent decades refining what he had unknowingly disrupted in silence. And every step he took felt heavier. Not from doubt, but from the weight of eyes following him, measuring him, recalculating him, and across the hall. Victoria Hale stood with her executive team, her posture flawless, her expression composed, but no longer dismissive, because she had spent the last 48 hours verifying what she had almost thrown away. And the results had not been kind to her certainty, while Daniel Reeves moved through the crowd with quiet purpose, speaking to no one for long, but being heard by everyone who mattered. And when Ethan reached the demonstration platform, smaller than the main stage, but surrounded by an audience that had grown far beyond its intended capacity, the hum of conversation softened into expectation. Not because they respected him yet, but because curiosity had become too expensive to ignore, and the engine sat there under neutral lighting, unchanged in appearance, still rough, still imperfect, still something that looked like it didn't belong in a place like this. And for a brief moment, Ethan thought about Lily, about the way she had smiled when he told her he had to show their engine to more people, about the way she had said, "Make them listen this time." And he exhaled slowly before stepping forward, his hand resting lightly on the frame, grounding himself in something real as the moderator announced him with a name that sounded unfamiliar in that context. And then it began, not with a speech, not with a pitch, but with action. Because Ethan had learned that words had failed him in rooms like these, and so he simply started the engine, and the sound-controlled, efficient, almost unnaturally smooth cut through the ambient noise like a line drawn between what people thought they knew and what they were about to learn. And the screens behind him lit up with live data feeds. Daniel had insisted on integrating numbers that updated in real time, transparent, undeniable. And the first minute passed in near silence as the output stabilized, and then the murmurs began low at first, then rising as the figures climbed past benchmarks that should have triggered alarms, past limits that had defined the industry for years, and still the system held, not straining, not fluctuating, just working. And one of the lead engineers from a major firm stepped closer, unable to stop himself, his eyes fixed on the data, his lips moving as if recalculating equations in his head while Victoria watched from the edge of the platform. Her earlier confidence replaced by something sharper, something more dangerous, recognition. And Daniel stood just behind Ethan, not interfering, not guiding, but present in a way that signaled to everyone watching that this moment mattered. And when Ethan increased the load, pushing the engine further, the room leaned in collectively, because this was where it should fail, where the theory should collapse under reality, and instead the numbers rose again, steady, precise, and the silence that followed wasn't confusion anymore. It was impact, the kind that ripples outward before anyone can contain it, and Daniel stepped forward. Then his voice calm, but carrying effortlessly across the space. "What you are seeing is not an incremental improvement," he said, glancing briefly at the audience before returning his gaze to the engine. "It is a structural shift in efficiency, and that was all it took. Because coming from him, those words weren't opinion, they were signal. And the shift from curiosity to competition happened almost instantly. 5 million, a voice called out from the left, not loud, not dramatic, just direct. And for a second no one reacted, as if the number itself needed time to settle into meaning. And then another voice, sharper, faster. 12. And the room erupted into movement, Not chaos, but something close to it, because investors who had been observing from a distance were now stepping forward, closing gaps, positioning themselves in a race that had no formal structure, but very real stakes. And Ethan stood there momentarily still as the offers began to stack, not as negotiations, but as declarations, 15, 20, 28, each number cutting through the air with increasing urgency, and Victoria moved, then stepping onto the platform with a decisiveness that reclaimed some of her earlier authority. 35 million, she said, her voice clear, controlled, but unmistakably competitive, and the room reacted not with surprise, but with escalation. Because if she was willing to commit at that level, then the ceiling had just moved, and Daniel watched it all with a faint, almost amused focus, as if this was exactly what he had anticipated. And another investor, one of the largest energy funds in the room, raised his hand slightly. Not shouting, not rushing. 42, he said, and the tension tightened further because now it wasn't just about interest, it was about dominance, about who would control what this engine represented. And Ethan felt it then, the shift from being ignored to being contested, the strange disorienting gravity of value when it is finally recognized, and for a moment he thought about the garage, about the quiet nights, about Lily's small savings box, about the simplicity of building something because it mattered, and how far that felt from this. And then Victoria spoke again, her voice cutting through the rising noise with precision. 50 million, she said. And this time the room did fall silent, not gradually but completely, because that number wasn't just an offer, it was a line. A statement that she intended to end the race to reclaim what she had nearly dismissed. And all eyes turned not to her, but to Ethan. Because for the first time since this had begun, the decision wasn't in a boardroom. It wasn't behind closed doors. It was here, visible, immediate, and entirely his. And Daniel stepped slightly to the side, giving him the space without saying a word. His earlier influence now replaced by something more important. Absence, the kind that forces clarity. And Ethan looked at the engine, at the data still streaming across the screens, at the faces surrounding him. Some eager, some calculating, some still trying to catch up, and then at Victoria, whose expression held none of the mockery from before, only focus, only intent. And he realized then that the reversal wasn't just about money. It wasn't even about validation. It was about control, about whether the thing he had built in obscurity would now belong to the same world that had nearly erased it. And the silence stretched just long enough to become pressure. And then he spoke, his voice steady, not loud, but carrying in a way that cut through everything else. It's not for sale, he said. And for a heartbeat no one moved, because that wasn't the expected answer. Not at this level. Not at this moment. And then the room shifted again. Not with offers this time, but with something more complex, something that hadn't been part of the bidding war at all. Respect. The silence that followed Ethan's words did not fracture into outrage or disbelief, the way it might have hours earlier. Instead, it settled into something quieter, something heavier, as if the entire room had been forced to recalibrate. Not just the value of the engine, but the man standing behind it, and for the first time since he had walked into that boardroom days ago. Ethan was no longer being measured against expectations. He didn't fit. He was defining them, and Victoria Hale stepped forward slowly, not with the authority she once carried like armor, but with a rare, unguarded honesty that caught even her own team off balance. I was wrong, she said, her voice steady, but stripped of its usual edge. And the admission landed harder than any number spoken before, because it wasn't strategic. It was real. And Ethan looked at her for a moment, not with resentment, not even with triumph, but with a calm that came from knowing he no longer needed her approval to validate what he had built. You didn't see it, he replied quietly. That doesn't mean it wasn't there. And there was no accusation in his tone, only truth, the kind that didn't demand apology, but allowed it to exist. And Victoria nodded once, absorbing that, her expression softening in a way no one in that room had likely ever witnessed, while Daniel Reeves watched from the side. A faint smile touching his lips, as if the outcome he had anticipated had finally reached its most important conclusion. Not the bidding war, not the money. But this moment of clarity and the conversation that followed shifted away from ownership toward partnership, from acquisition toward protection, as Ethan outlined what mattered to him, not just funding, but control over how the engine would be developed, how it would be used, how it would impact a world that had nearly dismissed it before understanding it. And the investors, now operating from respect rather than assumption, listened differently, asked differently, because they understood that what they were dealing with wasn't just innovation, it was conviction. And hours later, when the summit lights dimmed and the crowd dispersed into quieter negotiations and whispered strategies, Ethan stepped outside into the cool night air, the noise of the event fading behind him as he pulled out his phone, his hand steady now, grounded. And when Lily answered, her voice bright and immediate, "Did they listen?" This time he smiled, the tension finally releasing in a way that felt less like victory and more like arrival. "Yeah," he said softly, looking up at the city lights stretching endlessly before him. They did. And somewhere between the garage where it all began and the stage where everything changed, Ethan understood that the true value of what he had built was never just in the engine itself, but in the years he believed in it when no one else would, because real value doesn't appear when people recognize it. It exists long before that, waiting for the moment someone finally sees it.